Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar Weekly discussion topic video. In this video I'm going to be looking back at the Promise comic series. It's been a long time since I've read this and I definitely want to discuss it just because I feel it's the one comic series that tends to get a lot of negativity online when I don't think it's that bad. In fact, I think it's a really good series. It absolutely is kind of flawed as the first comic series, but the aim here is to kind of point those flaws out and also just to highlight the key events in this series that make it really interesting and that it's worth going back to read. And if you haven't read it because of what you've heard, it's absolutely a worthy comic series to seek out and read. So that's the aim with this video. I've had a few people suggest to me some other topics. The main one I saw was talking about the Dai Li / history of Ba Sing Se, and I definitely will do that one at some point. That is a topic I do need to do a little bit of research on. I need to go back and rewatch episodes, reread some stuff, and that sort of thing. Because there are certain topics, like last week's video about Rava, where I can literally just sit down without having to rewatch anything and just talk about it in depth because I know everything that's in my head. The Dai Li Ba Sing Se stuff, I probably could do a decent video just talking about it, but it's definitely something I need to refresh myself on before I do it. So, just like everyone, you can't remember everything in the entire series, and you do have to rewatch and reread some stuff from time to time. So that will come, but it'll take me some time to get back in terms of reading that. So let's get into The Promise. The first main Avatar comic series, the first three-parter series that really kicked off the idea that we are going to be continuing the Avatar story post Avatar: The Last Airbender, the TV series. We had short comic strips before collected into the Lost Adventures collection, but this was the first fully character-driven story we were getting. The first time Team Guru and Gene Yang were coming together as a creative team. So it's the first time Gene Yang is writing for Avatar, not the first time Team Guru has done Avatar art, but it's the first time doing something with so many pages, so many books and stuff like that. So it was a big test to see how this was. I think in general, most people were pretty impressed with what they managed to accomplish, but as the other comic series came out, I think this tended to be the one that people went back to and went like, it's not great, if there's any comic series to skip, it's this one. I don't agree with that. I think there are some flaws, but there are some flaws with all of the comic series, and The Promise especially, I think, has some really good stuff that people tend to miss out on because of what other people say about it. So I'll start with the negatives before I get into the positives, because there are much more positives to talk about, so I'll get the negatives out of the way. For me, the main negatives with this book are, one, the art you can see is good, but given the way like Smoke and Shadow Part 2, the most recently released comic, looks, you can absolutely tell how much Team Guru have developed as artists over time. It's not that going back, the art here looks bad. It's still very good, but you can see the evolution of their style. Their early stuff on Avatar makes the characters look very young. It's very cartoony, and still very clean, but not as clean as it eventually becomes. But over time, I suppose midway through the search, they really just got their style down, and it's been very consistent ever since then. In terms of the characters look their age, it's not perfectly like Avatar: The Last Airbender like art style. It still is their comic style that suits the medium of comics, versus obviously Avatar usually being an animation. But it absolutely works, and you can see how much they developed with time. Gene Yang's writing, I think, also has developed. I think it's been a much bigger leap in terms of the art than it was with the writing, in that I think the concept stuff is all there for Gene Yang. It's just realizing what to focus on. He very much began to focus more clearly on what each story was about post The Promise, because my main issue with The Promise is that there's a bit too much going on. There's a few too many characters we're trying to follow throughout this entire series. It's a big political issue that involves a lot of people, absolutely, but the comic does tend to focus on a few too many people, in that, like, okay, our main players are basically King Kuei, Fire Lord Zuko, Avatar Aang, Katara's in there as well, and you know, some of the other key characters like Korrie and her family, and like other like military people that need to be involved. That's fine. But then you're also getting introduced to, like, okay, Toph and Sokka have this side plot. Suki then comes in and they eventually join the main story at the end, but not before Sokka's helped Toph deal with her metal bending students and help to train them a bit, and they have this fight against a Fire Nation dojo, and then they join the fight, and you have Sneers is dating Korrie, and here's some freedom fighter stuff with Smellerbee and Longshot, and all of this other stuff happening that takes a little bit away from what the fundamental key part of the series is. There are other side plots that I think are very well done, like the Air Acolytes and getting introduced to them. And like overall, you know, some of these side plots do link in quite well to the overall theme of the book. The idea that the world is changing. It's not so four nations have to be separate anymore, that the cultures are beginning to come together. Relationships between the different nations are happening. And Katara is an example of that. Korrie and Sneers is an example of that. Even just the friendships between the various like leaders are a good example of that. In that, as I said, the key leaders that we're kind of dealing with here are kind of Katara, Aang. I suppose Katara doesn't really represent the Water Tribe, but I suppose she technically kind of has that aspect here. King Kuei for the Earth Kingdom and Zuko for the Fire Nation, and then obviously Aang is friends with Toph. Team Avatar very much represented the world coming together as one, and all these other relationships happening. So that works quite nicely. And then just the idea that there are these fan clubs for Aang throughout the world, mainly the Earth Kingdom, of people who are very interested in Airbender culture and have been kind of finding it out and teaching themselves it. Some of them taking it further than others. Now he likes the first fan club he sees, but the second one took it too far. And you can just see the idea that, oh, these are people not originally from the Air Nation, but they're trying to bring that culture back because they seem more interested in that than their own. And at the end of the book, obviously, when Aang makes the decision to actively begin training them as like Air Acolytes to help bring the Air Nation back, it is a pretty big moment. It's a nicely done moment. Yu Dao is a good representation of that as well, in that it is the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom kind of living together. There are certain problems still in the city, but overall it represents a positive for the world, and I like how most of the book has that come together. It's just that I do feel that they probably should have left a lot of the Metalbender School stuff for another time, perhaps at the very start of the Rift have that happen, and have all of the top stuff kind of in the Rift rather than having a little bit of it here. And again, some of it isn't quite nice, but you know, dealing with a lot of it later. So there's that. You know, you have Aang and Roku have a big argument, and there's just a lot happening here. Whereas I think if you look at this in a very focused way in terms of the key points of the main plot, I think it's a fascinating story. Absolutely the key positive to take out of the story is the whole conflict between the leaders. And getting into that in depth, I think, is what most of this video is going to be. The issue, I like where it comes from, in that fundamentally where the whole conflict over Yu Dao comes from is back in Roku's time when he was the Avatar. Sozin, the first move he made to expand the Fire Nation into other territory was to establish the first Fire Nation colony in Yu Dao. That's effectively what we're meant to believe here, that this is what Sozin and Roku's big argument happens over, the Sozin's move into Yu Dao. And it's a colony that stays there despite Roku's warning though Sozin doesn't expand any further than that until Roku dies. And that brings the whole Roku factor into things. But so you have Yu Dao part of the Fire Nation still, basically throughout the entire 100-Year War. And so when we get to the present of this story, a year after the war has ended, they've dealt with a lot of the stuff. The Fire Nation is in a better position now with the rest of the world. They still have to make amends, but the last thing to be resolved is what to do with the Fire Nation colonies. And so this is where the Harmony Restoration movement comes in, and the key conflict of this book. That's a really nice kind of idea to deal with as the conflict. How do you deal with this? You have to do something with it. You can't just leave it as is. The idea that, okay, the people of this place have lived there for 100 years. They have their roots there, their family there. It is a linked community of Earthbenders and Fire Nation. So you have people who seriously call this their home, even though they're from the Fire Nation. You can't just uproot them because the four nations have to remain four. But at the same time, politically speaking, you can't just really say that, oh, it's been so long, even though this city was technically formed by the war and evil people, we're just going to leave it as is. Something has to be done about it. So you can see both sides of it there, in that, you can't just justify part of the war that, oh, the Fire Nation get to keep this bit of the Earth Kingdom because they've been there for a while now. But you also can't just uproot so many people who have called that their home for generations. So this is where the idea of basically the new world, the way it's forming, that the lines between the nations aren't so set in stone anymore. That comes into play here, and Katara bring up the idea that maybe Yu Dao can be the exception. It can be a place that's neither Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom. It's just a place to itself. That's a really interesting concept here that we're getting, and it ultimately is a thing that continues, and eventually Yu Dao becomes the central point for Republic City, and it's a really cool idea that they have here in the way it happens, because yes, it's a key political conflict, but what makes the conflict even worse is the fact that all of our world leaders at this point in time are very inexperienced. You have King Kuei, who has very little active experience being the leader of his kingdom, because Long Feng's been basically in control of all everything political for the last however long. So this is his first chance to really make a mark as the proper leader of the Earth Kingdom. You have Zuko, again, early days as Fire Lord. He has to be seen to be apologetic for the Fire Nation, trying to make amends with the other nations after their nation caused the war. So he kind of has to acquiesce to the others' demands effectively, but still fight for the rights of his own people. And then you have Aang as the Avatar, trying to keep balance in the whole point of view, but still having to have an active role in things, and just seeing how the role of the Avatar has actually evolved with the way that the world has evolved, in that he starts out thinking that, okay, my role is to keep balance between the four nations, and that involves keeping them separate and balanced in that way, but you have to, that role has to evolve with the world and realize that, okay, I have to keep balance in terms of conflict between people, but if the people are finding peace, coming together, different nations, then I just have to find a different way to kind of help resolve things, and that's where Aang's conflict with Roku comes into things. So I think it's a fascinating setup for a story, and the way it obviously ends up panning out with Zuko basically making the first key point of action of the story, with asking Aang basically, if you ever see me starting to become like my father, I want you to end me, I want you to kill me, I want you to be the safety net for the world, that if I ever start to become like one of the evil Fire Lords of the past, take me out before anything happens. And Katara basically tells Aang to agree to this, just in case. And So you have Aang dealing with this idea that he managed to resolve the 100-Year War without killing Ozai. Now he's being put in this situation over the Harmony Restoration movement. Do I kill Zuko over this because he's suddenly, through advice of Ozai and meeting the people of Yu Dao, decided to abandon the Harmony Restoration movement and support the people of Yu Dao? So you have Aang, before he's developed his point of view, thinking that Zuko's going against him, and Roku also urging him to fulfill the promise sooner rather than later and take out Zuko because he's threatening the balance of the world here, in that Quay is angry at Zuko now because Quay is losing a part of his kingdom here if Zuko is supporting the colony staying as is, and he doesn't necessarily agree with that. So you have a really, really complex situation here of Aang as an airbender, his philosophy of his people and trying to keep them alive when there's so few left in the world. He's trying to keep that philosophy alive, so he doesn't want to kill Zuko, but his role as the Avatar is kind of suggesting he do kill Zuko, and especially with Roku's urgings. And a lot of people criticize Roku for basically telling Aang to kill Zuko, his own great-grandson and stuff like that, but I definitely think it was ultimately, Aang is proven to be right about the whole situation, and he manages to resolve the situation without having to kill Zuko. But from the perspective of where Roku is coming from, you can understand exactly why he makes that decision. He blames himself so much for what Aang has to go through right now, that if he had just taken out Sozin when he had the chance, the war would never have happened. There would be no need for Aang to have so much to deal with. No need for Aang to even have to attempt to kill Zuko. It would have just been, he takes out Sozin, conflict over, done, let's go home. And so now he has a chance as the advisor to Aang to basically keep Aang from making the same mistake he did. But the thing is, I think Aang looks at what happened to Roku in the past and realizes that you made the right decision. He was your friend. You at the point in time chose not to kill him, and you were right. I would make the same decision, and I'm not going to do it here because it goes against my philosophy. He's my friend. I don't think this is as big a situation to kill him over, because I think it would have been a little bit harsh at the time, where it is just okay, from Roku's perspective, okay, my friend has started to expand into Earth Kingdom territory. He set up a couple of colonies. It's not super serious, but I have to deal with this now. And so he basically says to Sozin, do anything more than this and I will kill you, after they have their fight. So I think it would have been a little harsh to just you expanded into a couple of places, instant death, and resolve it from there. That would have caused, I think, more problems in the world. If he had known what Sozin was planning, I think he probably would have killed him and felt justified about it. But at the point in time, he couldn't have ever believed that Sozin would turn into this guy wanting to take over the entire world, who would order a complete genocide of a whole nation and nearly destroy the Water Tribe as well. So there's a lot of stuff happening in this comic, a lot of stuff being referenced here. So, Roku being very clear about, don't let the same thing that I do happen again. You understand where it comes from, and then when it is resolved in the rift and how it comes to an end how it's resolved in the promise, you understand why Aang separates from Roku. Roku doesn't have the perspective on what the world is like now. Aang doesn't need someone so heavily set in the past demanding Aang do something that is against the way the world is going right now. And then when he reconnects with Roku in the rift, you can see that Roku kind of understands what happened, the need for Aang to be separate for him for a while, that Roku could only ever advise Aang from his perspective as the Avatar, his experiences in his time, which was when the four nations were very separate, and the idea of forcefully bringing nations together was a problem. Whereas Aang in this comic begins to see the way the world is and the way people are coming together, and he doesn't need someone so set in the past. And so I think that's fine the way it ultimately ends up resolving itself, because Aang doesn't kill Zuko, because through the help of Katara, he's snapped out of anger and the chance to like kill him in the Avatar state a couple of times, with Katara basically urging Aang, like, no, you need to be in the right state of mind, thinking clearly about the situation. If you were and you were planning to kill Zuko, I would let you do it, but in the Avatar state, no way. So I like the role Katara plays as kind of like advisor to Aang. She's giving him her own perspective on the way the world is, with regards to the exception that Yu Dao could be, starts the idea in his head that if you're so set on the nations being separate, what does that mean for our relationship? We're from different nations. The way you're planning to do things, our relationship can't be the thing. So with that in mind, I'm going to let you go off, meditate, think about what you really want to do here, and regardless of the decision you make, the fact that you have thought about it, I will accept it, even if that means our relationship isn't going to be a thing going forward, if that means you have to kill Zuko, albeit, but I want to make sure that you're the one thinking about this before you do anything. And it really shows, an interesting side of her character, that she's aware that she's not the leader character here. Aang is the one who ultimately is going to have to make the key decisions, but she can help Aang and advise him to make a better decision. And in that sense, she plays a really interesting role in this, in terms of supporting Aang as the leader, but also as like her boyfriend. So I really like that. And then she goes on to obviously help Quay also see what he's been missing. And that with Quay, they play up the idea that he was always a king in his castle who missed everything that was going on. And even now, him wanting to play a better role as leader, he's also missing what's going on the ground. And so she brings him down to the battlefield to show him what he's been missing this whole time. That the piece of land that he's arguing so heavily for to keep as part of the Earth Kingdom and like kick the Fire Nation people out, are just normal people who've lived there for so long. You don't think Quay's evil or anything like that, because he just doesn't know. So the second he sees these happy people, like Fire Nation people and Earth Kingdom people, living together in peace as families, he instantly realizes that I'm wrong here. Stop this conflict that's about to happen. We can deal with this another way. And ultimately, like, the decision that's made is obviously to effectively separate Yu Dao, kind of Kyoshi style, from the rest of the world almost, and just make it a place to itself. Not part of the Fire Nation, not part of the Earth Kingdom, but a place to itself. That it's not quite a nation itself, but obviously over time it will become Republic City and stuff like that. But it has a nice resolution. And then with regard to the conflict between Aang and Zuko, you get this cool thing at the end where they've been setting up the whole time Aang is going to have to kill Zuko because he's beginning to become more like Ozai. But what happens at the end is, despite all these dreams that they're having about it actually happening, Aang ends up saving Zuko and realizing that, okay, Zuko wasn't completely right here, but he was more right than I was. Even if he didn't necessarily have the same development as I did, in that he was correct from the point of view of, like, the people have to be like the key people in this situation that we're thinking about. Their homes are important. Us getting rid of them for the sake of like a place being considered part of another place is less important than the people's homes. But at the same time, something did need to be done about the whole who owns this piece of land situation, and so the decision ends up being made. But Zuko, in the end, is kind of more right than Aang, and so that's the kind of resolution that he has. I suppose it's the thing he does learn from Ozai in the book, to trust himself more. Still use the advice from his friends, and that Aang is quite wise, but that he has to be able to trust his own decisions. And so that's fundamentally what he learns here. He's a lot more decisive after this book. He's always going to have a trouble making really tough decisions. That's just who he is. But he's no longer like kind of crippled by that problem. So that's really interesting. Like it's such a relief for Zuko when he finds out that he was kind of right in this whole situation. And so, you get probably one of my favorite parts of all of the comics we've got then towards the end of The Promise Part 3. Aang and Zuko in Iroh's tea shop towards the end of the series. And it's so interesting because you get this Aang and Zuko just talking to each other as friends, not necessarily as like world leaders anymore. It's just this idea that Zuko was just like, I was wrong to ask you to promise to kill me if I made a mistake. I wasn't using you as like a safety net for the whole world. I was using you as like an escape hatch for myself from having to make the strong decisions. I can't let that happen anymore. I have to be able to make more decisions on my own. And Aang then admits, I think in one of the best moments for his character in these comics so far, that he's always going to struggle with the idea that he's so connected to the people he cares about. It's always going to be a flaw of his that he tends to prioritize his connections to people above perhaps the fate of the whole world. That his family is so important to him, and he's just come to accept that that's kind of always going to be the case. And Zuko kind of comes to the conclusion that like to fully find balance within myself, I'm going to have to resolve a lot of the stuff going on in my life. What's happened to my mother, the issue with my sister and stuff like that. We're nearly at the end of that whole plot for Zuko. I think Smoke and Shadow kind of has to be the thing to kind of fully resolve all the issues with the Fire Nation royal family. But it's just so well done the way this conversation ends up playing out at the end. Just really well done in terms of development for Aang and Zuko. And then like Quay has a little bit of development, but he's never been the most main character. And then, as I said before already in this video, Katara plays such an amazing role in this comic. Both in, as I said, supporting Aang as a important world leader, but also as just a person, her boyfriend. Their relationship is really well fleshed out, and I think a lot of people tend to just dismiss their relationship in this comic as just, well, they're too cutesy around each other. It's too much. There's way too many sweeties, and then Sokka talking about oogies. I think the oogies thing is a little overdone, but I like the way it's kind of resolved at the end, and that the second he meets Suki, like Toph makes the joke towards Sokka, like, oogies, really. So that's well done. And then, as I said, like, that's not all their relationship is. Like, yes, they have an amazing relationship that's very positive and they don't argue with each other too much, but that's fine. Like, there are some relationships like Mei and Zuko where there are more arguments, but you can tell they still care about each other. But for Aang and Katara, I think you understand that that's never really been the case with them. They never tend to argue really heavily about stuff all that often, and so it makes sense that they are just super great around each other. So I don't really have any problem with the way they're portrayed as a couple in this book, because their relationship is shown in such a strong way throughout this, and that Katara is always there to help snap Aang out of a moment of anger or something like that, to advise him when to like think more about something or give him a different perspective on things. So I really like the relationship and the way it goes, and that Katara ends up having a very big influence over the course of where this story goes, in terms of her influencing Quay, her influencing Aang, which in turn helps Zuko. And it's a comic series that I feel is very underrated. There are absolutely parts of it that are not the best done, and focus too much on stuff. And as I said, the start of part 2 with the whole Kunyo firebender school versus Toph metalbending school, I think it takes up a little bit too much of the comic, but I still like the kind of development that happens with regards to Toph and her kind of realizing that she's been putting too much pressure on her students, which is the exact same sort of pressure she felt from her parents herself, which sets up the rift a bit more, and she eventually comes to have a bit more perspective, becomes a better teacher because of this, through the help of Sokka, and her students develop a bit more as well. The students, I don't think, are the best characters. They're much better in the Rift than they are here. They're very one note, Penga, the Dark One, Hotun, they're fine, but they're not amazing characters. Maybe they'll do something more with them in future comics, but for what they are, they're okay. But yeah, eventually, the top role in the series is just to fight with Suki and Sokka in the battle to keep everyone from killing each other at the end. Some final things to talk about. The Freedom Fighters, I like that they're in the comic. I like that we get to see some long shots, some sneers, Smellerbee, and then how kind of Corey is kind of linked in with them because she's dating Sneers. Corey I actually quite liked as a kind of brand new character who is very important, in that it's like, okay, strong female character who plays an important role in terms of being part of the family that kind of helps bring all of the leaders to the same conclusion. That just the existence of like her family, who eventually become kind of like the leaders of like Yu Dao going forward after this, they are so important as like this representation of a strong family of both like the Yu Dao, the Fire Nation colony in the Earth Kingdom coming together. She's an Earthbender, but she more sees herself as like a Fire Nation citizen. So she kind of represents the best of both worlds there, and kind of the positive conclusion from the city coming together. She represents what the world is like going forward, what's new about the world, At the time, obviously, we were seeing the start of Korra, and we were seeing a very changed world with, the idea that, like, Mako and Bolin were, like, Firebender and Earthbender brothers, and, like, their parents are kind of, have a similar background. And it was cool to see, effectively, one of the first families like that, where these two nations are so intertwined here that we are getting people who tend to think of themselves as, like, I'm an Earthbender citizen, but I'm a Firebender, and that sort of thing. It's really cool concepts, very good way of kind of setting up the idea of Yu Dao as the origin point for Republic City. It was really well done. Anything else? I'm just flicking through the comic pretty quickly here. The conflict between Aang and Zuko is kind of well done. You see Zuko struggle so much throughout this series with regards to Mei breaking up with him, because he's kind of so conflicted, so distracted. He's going to see Ozai, he wants to know about his mother, but Ozai is clearly trying to manipulate him into like make mistakes. But in the end, Ozai kind of ends up, I suppose, helping Zuko in a way, in that, like, okay, Ozai goes a bit too far with regards to saying, like, true leadership is not being conflicted over a decision about what's right and what's wrong and making the right decision. Being a true powerful leader is making a decision and then accepting that your decision is right because you are the most powerful person in the situation. That by definition, you being the leader, your decision is right, regardless of right and wrong. You are above right and wrong. And I like that Zuko does stand up for himself here and disagrees with Ozai and says, no one is above right and wrong. I still have to make the right decision here. But ends up kind of sticking to his guns because from his point of view, he thinks he is right. To prioritize the people above the political situation is right, but obviously he didn't quite have the perspective of like, okay, we need to full on make a new nation kind of type thing here. Anything else here? The Aang Air Acolyte plot I think is quite well done. It's a kind of cultural appropriation arc. He likes the idea of other people having an interest in Airbender culture, but when he finds out that other people have actually put blue arrow tattoos on their foreheads and like without earning them, he is turned off by that idea, but ends up realizing that, okay, it's going to take a while to even attempt to bring the Airbenders back. The fact that there are people showing interest in this, I have to take advantage of this, and I'll actually train them myself. So there's that nice moment at the very end of the book where Aang is training these air acolytes from both of the fan clubs and teaching them the ways of airbenders, which is basically what we see the people living in the air temples in Korra, like kind of Pema, They are people who are effectively air nomads, but their origins are from different nations, but they've chosen to go down the airbender path and choose that philosophy. It's a really interesting kind of origin kind of setup story. And then Katara, in terms of getting advice from Aang, her development herself, she gets a little bit jealous of all the kind of female attention Aang is getting from the fan clubs for Aang, but realizes how kind of petty in a way she was being, because Aang, the only enjoyment he was getting out of being around all these people was just the idea that for the first time in so long, he's around people who are interested and really care about air nomad culture. And there's this sense of like her realizing, like, I've been around him so long, realized how much he's gone through, but I've never attempted to learn more about his culture. I've been thinking about our future together, but have I really been thinking about the fact that our relationship going forward is going to have to be, in a way, about the future of the airbenders? If we ever have kids, an airbender kid, that's going to have to be a thing we deal with. And she feels so bad for a moment just about the fact that she was feeling jealous, annoyed at Aang, when Aang was just experiencing people interested in this culture for the first time in so long. And she very much changes here. I'd like to see a reference to this again going forward, her showing interest in airbender culture. You see her there kind of sitting on the outside of the kind of teaching lesson as Aang is giving the kind of lecture about air acolytes, but I think it's a really nice development thing that Katara doesn't just help Aang as a leader in this book, she learned a little bit herself. So that's where I'm going to end my thoughts on The Promise. I'll probably do the Dai Li video next week, but other than that, thanks for listening to this video, and bye.